Little girl interrupts a man's trial, shouting, "He's not guilty," not knowing she saved the CEO's life. Where are you watching from? We love seeing how far these stories can reach. Leave your comment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the upcoming emotional stories that touch the soul. The mahogany gavel struck 3 times, each blow echoing through the packed Manhattan courtroom like thunder before a storm. Judge Patricia Hendricks adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses, her weathered face stern as she surveyed the sea of reporters, legal professionals and curious onlookers who had gathered for what the media dubbed the trial of the century. Marcus Wellington sat rigidly in the defendant's chair, his once immaculate Armani suit wrinkled from nights in holding. Heavy steel restraints bound his wrists and ankles to the wooden chair, the metal catching the harsh fluorescent lights that made his olive complexion appear sickly pale. At 34, he had built Wellington Industries from a small tech startup into a multi-billion-dollar empire. But now his dark eyes held nothing but hollow resignation. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Hendricks's voice cut through the suffocating tension. The jury foreman, a middle-aged accountant named Robert Chen, stood slowly. "We have, Your Honor." Marcus's defense attorney, the renowned criminal lawyer David Parker, placed a reassuring hand on his client's shoulder, though his own confidence had evaporated days ago. The evidence against Marcus seemed insurmountable. Financial records allegedly showing embezzlement of pension funds, security footage that appeared to place him at the scene of a suspicious warehouse fire, and testimony from his former business partner claiming Marcus had threatened him weeks before the partner's mysterious disappearance. "In the matter of the people versus Marcus Wellington," the foreman continued, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment, "on the count of conspiracy to commit fraud." The courtroom held its collective breath. Flash photography had been banned, but the sketch artists worked frantically, capturing every nuance of this historic moment. Marcus closed his eyes, preparing for the words that would destroy everything he had built. But then, like a crack of lightning splitting the silence, a clear, defiant voice rang out from the back of the courtroom. "He's not guilty! He didn't do it!" Every head turned toward the double doors at the rear of the courtroom, where a small blonde girl in a powder blue dress stood with fierce determination blazing in her crystal blue eyes. Madison Sterling, though only 9 years old, commanded the attention of the entire room with the kind of presence that couldn't be taught or faked. "Order in my courtroom." Judge Hendricks banged her gavel, but her voice lacked its usual authority. Something about the child's unwavering certainty had shaken even her decades of judicial experience. Court security moved toward Madison, but she clutched a thick manila folder against her chest like armor. "I have proof," she declared, her voice carrying despite her small stature. "Real proof that shows who really did it." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters jumped to their feet, cameras flashed despite the ban, and voices rose in a cacophony of confusion and excitement. Marcus's head snapped up, his dark eyes focusing on the girl with a mixture of bewilderment and desperate hope. "Who is this child?" Judge Hendricks demanded, though she made no move to have Madison removed. Something in the girl's unwavering gaze suggested this was no publicity stunt or childish outburst. Victoria Sterling watched from the shadows near the exit, her heart hammering against her ribs as her carefully laid plan unfolded. At 31, she possessed the kind of understated beauty that made people look twice. Auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper, intelligent green eyes that missed nothing, and the graceful bearing of someone who had learned to carry herself with dignity despite having very little else. She had spent weeks preparing Madison for this moment, coaching her daughter on exactly what to say and when to say it. The folder Madison clutched contained copies of documents Victoria had painstakingly gathered over months of investigation, evidence that pointed to the real orchestrator of the crimes Marcus was accused of committing. But as Victoria watched her daughter stand alone before the most powerful people in the city, guilt and terror warred in her chest. Madison didn't know the whole truth about why they were here, didn't understand that the man she was trying to save was the father who had never known she existed. 9 years ago, Victoria had been a promising young associate at a prestigious law firm, working late into the night on a merger that would make or break her career. Marcus had been the opposing counsel, brilliant and magnetic, with the kind of confidence that drew people like moths to flame. One late night of document review had turned into dinner. Dinner had become drinks, and drinks had become the most passionate night of Victoria's life. She had never intended for it to go beyond that one night. Marcus was from a different world, the son of old money, heir to a business empire, someone who moved in circles Victoria could only dream of entering. But when she discovered she was pregnant 6 weeks later, everything changed. The threats had started almost immediately after she gathered the courage to tell Marcus about the baby. Anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night, warning her to stay away and keep quiet or face the consequences. Photos of her apartment building appeared in her mailbox with red X's marked over her windows. Her car tires were slashed twice in 1 week. The message was clear: disappear, or something terrible would happen to both her and the baby. So Victoria had done the only thing she could do. She had taken her savings, left her job, and moved to a different neighborhood where she could raise Madison in anonymity. She'd worked multiple jobs, paralegal work when she could find it, waitressing when she couldn't, anything to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. She had watched from afar as Marcus's career soared, as Wellington Industries grew into a corporate giant, as his name appeared in newspapers and magazines as one of the city's most eligible bachelors. She had seen the photos of him at charity galas and business functions, always impeccably dressed, always confident, never knowing that somewhere across the city his daughter was learning to walk, to talk, to read. Madison had asked about her father, of course. Victoria had crafted a careful story about a man who had to go away for work, who loved them both but couldn't be with them. It wasn't entirely a lie, she told herself. Marcus would have loved Madison if he'd known about her. She was certain of that, even after all these years. "Bailiff, please escort the child to my chambers," Judge Hendricks commanded, her voice cutting through Victoria's memories and bringing her back to the present crisis. But Madison stood her ground, raising the folder higher. "You need to see this first. He's innocent and I can prove it." Marcus leaned forward in his restraints, studying the girl with growing intensity. Something about her seemed familiar, though he couldn't place what it was. The stubborn set of her jaw, perhaps, or the way she held herself with such unwavering conviction. It reminded him of someone, but the memory danced just beyond his reach. "Your Honor," David Parker stood quickly, sensing an opportunity. "If this child has evidence relevant to my client's case, shouldn't we examine it before proceeding with the verdict?" The prosecutor, a sharp-faced woman named Helen Morrison, shot to her feet. "Objection! This is clearly a desperate publicity stunt. We can't allow random children to interrupt legal proceedings with unsubstantiated claims." But Judge Hendricks was studying Madison with the keen eye of someone who had seen every trick and ploy the legal system had to offer. "Bring the child forward," she decided. "Let's see what she has to say." As Madison walked down the center aisle, her small feet silent on the worn carpet, every eye in the courtroom followed her. Victoria's hands clenched into fists at her sides, fighting every maternal instinct that screamed at her to run down there and protect her daughter from this circus. But this was the only way. The evidence Victoria had uncovered was explosive, but it had been obtained through channels that weren't entirely legal. If she presented it herself, it would be thrown out, and Marcus would spend the rest of his life in prison for crimes he didn't commit. But if an innocent child found the evidence and brought it forward, Madison reached the front of the courtroom and looked up at Judge Hendricks with calm determination. "My name is Madison Sterling," she said clearly. "I'm 9 years old, and I found something very important that everyone needs to know." Judge Hendricks leaned forward, her stern expression softening slightly. "What did you find, Madison?" Madison opened the folder with careful precision, revealing neat stacks of photocopied documents, photographs, and handwritten notes. "I found out who really stole the money and hurt those people," she said. "And it wasn't him." She pointed directly at Marcus, who was staring at her with something approaching wonder. "How did you come to have these documents?" the judge asked. Madison had been coached for this question. "My mom works really hard," she said simply. "She stays up late sometimes looking at papers and making phone calls. She didn't know I was watching, but I saw her crying one night when she was reading about how Mr. Wellington was in trouble. She said it wasn't fair that someone was lying, so I decided to help her find the truth." It was masterful in its simplicity, a child's innocent desire to help her hard-working mother, stumbling upon evidence that adults had missed. The jury members leaned forward, their earlier certainty about Marcus's guilt beginning to waver. Victoria closed her eyes, knowing that everything now depended on Madison's performance and the documents she carried. The real evidence pointed to Marcus's business partner, Richard Blackwood, who had systematically embezzled funds over years while carefully framing Marcus for his crimes. Blackwood had been the one issuing the threats, trying to ensure Victoria and her daughter stayed out of his way, but proving that would require more than just documents. It would require Madison to be brave beyond her years, to stand before this room full of powerful adults and speak a truth that could save an innocent man, her father, while exposing a dangerous criminal who would stop at nothing to protect his secrets. As Madison began to explain what the documents revealed, her clear voice carrying across the silent courtroom, Victoria felt tears streaming down her cheeks. Her daughter didn't know she was saving her father, but she was fighting for justice with the same fierce determination that had always defined the Wellington family. And for the first time in 9 years, Victoria dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could finally come home. 9 years earlier, the rain pelted the windows of Morrison and Associates' 42nd floor offices as Victoria Sterling hunched over her laptop, surrounded by towers of legal documents that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. The corporate merger between Wellington Industries and Hartfield Manufacturing had been dragging on for 3 months, with both sides fighting over every clause, every comma, every potential loophole. At 22, Victoria was the youngest associate at one of Manhattan's most prestigious law firms, a scholarship kid from Queens who had clawed her way through Harvard Law with a combination of brilliant intellect and sheer determination. She wore her success like armor, hiding her working-class background behind carefully selected designer suits purchased from outlet stores and practiced confidence she had learned to fake until it felt real. The clock on her computer showed 11:47 p.m., but Victoria barely noticed. She thrived on these high-stakes negotiations, loved the intellectual chess match of corporate law, even when it meant surviving on coffee and determination for days at a time. What she hadn't expected was for the opposing counsel to be someone like Marcus Wellington. At 25, Marcus possessed the kind of effortless charisma that came from growing up in boardrooms and country clubs. His dark hair was always perfectly styled, his suits were clearly bespoke, and when he smiled, it transformed his entire face from merely handsome to absolutely devastating. But it was his mind that truly captivated Victoria, sharp, strategic, and quick enough to match her point for point in their legal sparring. "Miss Sterling," Marcus's voice carried across the conference room as he appeared in the doorway, still looking impossibly fresh despite the late hour. "I thought everyone had gone home hours ago." Victoria looked up from her laptop, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must appear. "Just reviewing the environmental impact clauses one more time," she said, pushing a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "Your client's mining operations in Pennsylvania need additional oversight language." Marcus stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "You know, in all the months we've been working on this deal, I don't think we've had a conversation that didn't involve contract disputes or regulatory compliance." "That's what we're paid for," Victoria replied, though she couldn't help smiling. There had been an undercurrent of attraction between them throughout the negotiations, carefully professional but unmistakably present in the way their eyes would meet across the conference table, the way Marcus would find excuses to stand close to her when reviewing documents. "True," Marcus said, settling into the chair across from her. "But it's past midnight, and I think we've both earned a break from being adversaries. Would you like to grab dinner? I know a place that's still open." Victoria hesitated. Dating opposing counsel was professionally risky, potentially career-ending if it went wrong. But Marcus's dark eyes held genuine interest, not just the predatory charm she'd encountered from other powerful men in her orbit. "Just dinner," she said finally. "And we're not discussing the merger." "Deal," Marcus grinned, extending his hand to shake on it. When their fingers touched, Victoria felt a jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with the fluorescent office lighting. The restaurant Marcus chose was an intimate Italian place in Little Italy, the kind of establishment that stayed open late for people who lived their lives by unpredictable schedules. They sat in a corner booth, sharing a bottle of wine that probably cost more than Victoria's monthly grocery budget, talking about everything except the legal case that had brought them together. Marcus told her about growing up with expectations that felt suffocating, about the pressure of carrying a family name that opened doors but also created impossible standards. Victoria found herself sharing stories about her childhood in Queens, about parents who worked multiple jobs to pay for her education, about feeling like an imposter in the rarefied world of corporate law. "You're not an imposter," Marcus said seriously, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his. "You're the smartest lawyer I've ever worked with. Your client is lucky to have you." The wine, the late hour, and Marcus's intense attention combined to make Victoria feel reckless in a way that was completely unlike her usual careful nature. When he suggested they go back to his apartment for coffee, she knew it was an excuse, knew exactly what would happen if she said yes. She said yes anyway. Marcus's penthouse overlooked Central Park, all floor-to-ceiling windows and modern art that Victoria recognized from museum catalogues. But she barely noticed the luxury surroundings because Marcus was kissing her with a passion that made her forget about professional boundaries, career consequences, and everything else except the way he made her feel. They made love on Egyptian cotton sheets while the city sparkled below them, and for those perfect hours, Victoria allowed herself to pretend she belonged in this world of wealth and privilege. Marcus was tender and attentive, treating her body like something precious, whispering her name against her skin like a prayer. When Victoria woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the massive windows, and Marcus was already dressed for work, adjusting his tie in front of an antique mirror. "Good morning," he said, turning to smile at her. "There's coffee brewing in the kitchen, and I left some clothes on the chair that should fit you." The clothes were beautiful. A silk blouse and tailored skirt that probably cost more than Victoria's monthly salary. The gesture was thoughtful, but it also reminded her of the vast gulf between their worlds. Marcus could casually leave designer clothes for overnight guests, because such expenditures meant nothing to him. "Thank you," Victoria said quietly, suddenly feeling exposed in ways that had nothing to do with being naked under his expensive sheets. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, reaching out to stroke her hair. "I had an amazing time last night," he said. "I'd like to see you again after the merger is finalized." Victoria nodded, not trusting her voice. She wanted that too, wanted it more than she had ever wanted anything. But already, in the harsh morning light, she could see how impossible it would be. They came from different universes, and last night had been a beautiful anomaly, not the beginning of something real. The merger concluded 2 weeks later, with both sides claiming victory in the business press. Victoria threw herself back into other cases, trying to forget the way Marcus had looked at her, the way he had made her feel beautiful and brilliant and worthy of someone like him. When she realized she was pregnant 6 weeks later, staring at 2 pink lines on a drugstore test in her tiny studio apartment bathroom, her first emotion was joy. Despite everything logical and practical, despite knowing how complicated this would make her life, she was happy. She was carrying Marcus's child, a piece of that perfect night that would be hers forever. She spent 3 days working up the courage to call him, rehearsing what she would say, how she would tell him. She finally reached him on a Thursday evening, her hands shaking as she dialed his direct office number. "Marcus, it's Victoria Sterling," she said when he answered. "From the Hartfield merger. I need to speak with you about something important." "Victoria." His voice warmed immediately. "I've been meaning to call you. I've thought about you every day since I'm pregnant," she blurted out, unable to endure the small talk when her entire future hung in the balance. The silence stretched for so long that Victoria wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "Are you certain?" "Yes. I took 3 tests. I'm about 8 weeks along." Another pause. "I see. And you're sure it's mine?" The question hit Victoria like a physical blow. "Of course I'm sure," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "You're the only person I've been with in months." "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to imply. This is just unexpected." Marcus's voice was distant now, all warmth gone. "What do you want to do?" "I want to keep the baby," Victoria said quietly. "I'm not asking you for anything, Marcus. I just thought you deserved to know." "We should meet," Marcus said after another long pause. "Tomorrow evening. There's a lot we need to discuss." They arranged to meet at a quiet coffee shop in Midtown, somewhere neutral where they could talk without being recognized by anyone from their professional circles. Victoria spent the day oscillating between hope and terror, imagining scenarios that ranged from Marcus proposing marriage to him demanding she terminate the pregnancy. She arrived early and chose a corner table, ordering a decaf coffee she was too nervous to drink. When Marcus walked in 10 minutes later, he looked haggard, like he hadn't slept since their phone conversation. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, sliding into the chair across from her. "I've been thinking about this situation all night." "Situation," Victoria repeated, her heart sinking at his choice of words. Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. "Victoria, I care about you. What happened between us was significant. But my life is complicated right now. The company is going through a major expansion. There are board meetings and investors to consider, and my family has certain expectations about who I'll eventually marry." "I told you I'm not asking for anything," Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know, but a child changes everything." Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a check, placing it on the table between them. "This should cover any medical expenses, plus enough to help you get settled wherever you decide to go." Victoria stared at the check without touching it. The amount was more money than she had ever seen in one place, enough to disappear completely, if that's what he wanted. "You want me to leave?" she said. "I think it would be best," Marcus said gently. "For everyone involved. You could start fresh somewhere else, build a new life. The child would have everything they need." Victoria felt something fundamental breaking inside her chest. She had known this was a possibility, had tried to prepare herself for rejection, but the reality was more devastating than she had imagined. "And you?" she asked. "You'll just pretend this never happened?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "I'll always remember you, Victoria. Always." But I can't give you the life you deserve, and I can't be the father this child needs, not with everything else going on in my world." Victoria stood up slowly, leaving the check on the table. "I won't cash this," she said, "and I won't bother you again. But someday, Marcus, you're going to regret this choice. Someday, you're going to realize what you gave up." She walked out of the coffee shop and never looked back, even though she could feel Marcus watching her through the window. That night she cried until she had no tears left, mourning not just the relationship that might have been, but the family her child would never know. The threat started 3 days later. The first phone call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, jolting Victoria from an uneasy sleep in her studio apartment. She fumbled for her phone, expecting a wrong number or maybe an emergency involving one of her parents. "Miss Sterling." The voice was electronically distorted, unrecognizable as male or female. "We know about your condition." Victoria sat up straighter, instantly alert. "Who is this?" "Someone who wants to help you make the right decision. Stay away from Marcus Wellington. Forget you ever met him. Forget about the child." "I already told Marcus I wouldn't contact him again," Victoria said, her heart racing. "I don't want anything from him." "It's not about what you want," the voice continued coldly. "It's about what's best for everyone involved. Disappear, Miss Sterling. Take the money and go somewhere far away. If you stay in New York, if you try to contact Mr. Wellington again, there will be consequences." The line went dead, leaving Victoria staring at her phone in the darkness. She tried to convince herself it was some kind of sick prank, but the caller had known about her pregnancy, had known about her conversation with Marcus. Someone was watching her, someone who wanted her gone. The second call came 3 nights later at 3:33 a.m. This time, the voice was different but equally chilling. "You didn't take our advice," the caller said without preamble. "That was unwise." "I haven't done anything," Victoria protested, though she was whispering, afraid that somehow they could hear her even now. "I haven't contacted Marcus or told anyone about—" "But you're still here," the voice interrupted, "still planning to have the child, still thinking you can be part of his world. You can't. You won't. Leave now, or we'll make you leave." Victoria's hands were shaking as she hung up. She immediately called the police, but the desk sergeant who took her report was clearly skeptical. Without any threats of specific violence, without any evidence beyond anonymous phone calls, there was little they could do. They suggested she change her phone number and consider staying with friends for a few days. But the harassment escalated beyond phone calls. Victoria came home from work the next evening to find her apartment door ajar, though nothing inside appeared to be missing. A few days later, her car tires were slashed while she was at the grocery store. Someone left dead flowers outside her apartment door with a note that simply read, "Final warning." The breaking point came when Victoria found photographs slipped under her door, surveillance shots of her walking to work, eating lunch in the firm's cafeteria, even sleeping in her bed, taken through her apartment window. The message was clear. They could reach her anywhere, anytime. Victoria realized with growing terror that these weren't random threats from someone jealous of Marcus's wealth or attention. This was organized, professional, and connected to people with serious resources. Someone in Marcus's orbit wanted her gone badly enough to hire professionals to make it happen. She tried calling Marcus one more time, desperate to warn him about what was happening, but his assistant informed her coolly that Mr. Wellington was not taking her calls and had no interest in speaking with her about any matter. That night, 12 weeks pregnant and terrified for both her life and her unborn child's safety, Victoria made the hardest decision of her life. She cleaned out her savings account, resigned from Morrison & Associates via email, and packed everything she could fit into 2 suitcases. At dawn, she took a taxi to Grand Central Station and bought a ticket to the first city on the departure board, Albany. From there, she would figure out where to go next, Somewhere far enough from New York that Marcus's enemies couldn't find her, somewhere she could disappear completely. The next 8 years were a blur of survival, of working multiple jobs and moving whenever she felt too settled, too visible. Victoria changed her last name to Sterling, created a new identity built on carefully constructed lies, and forged documents she purchased from people who specialized in helping others disappear. She worked as a paralegal when she could find firms that didn't ask too many questions about her employment history. When legal work wasn't available, she waited tables, cleaned houses, did whatever it took to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. Madison was born in a public hospital in Buffalo, with Victoria completely alone, except for an overworked delivery nurse who held her hand during the worst contractions. When they placed her daughter in her arms for the first time, Victoria sobbed with relief and overwhelming love. Madison had Marcus's dark hair and his determined chin, but her eyes were Victoria's green, bright with intelligence and curiosity. "Hello, beautiful girl," Victoria whispered, tracing Madison's tiny features with her finger. "It's just you and me now, but I promise I'll keep you safe. I promise I'll give you everything I can." Victoria told Madison carefully crafted stories about her father, that he was a good man who had to go away for work, that he loved them both but couldn't be with them. She created a mythology around Marcus that painted him as a hero rather than the man who had rejected them, because she couldn't bear to poison her daughter against someone who might genuinely not have known about the threats that drove them away. As Madison grew, Victoria was amazed daily by her daughter's brilliant mind and fierce spirit. By age 4, Madison was reading chapter books. By 6, she was solving math problems that challenged 5th graders. But it was her sense of justice that most reminded Victoria of the man they had left behind. Madison couldn't tolerate unfairness in any form. She stood up to bullies at school, defended younger children who were being picked on, and once organized her entire 2nd grade class to protest when their teacher punished everyone for one student's misbehavior. "It's not right, Mama," Madison would say, with the same determined expression Victoria had seen on Marcus's face during their legal negotiations. "Someone has to speak up when things aren't fair." Victoria tried to channel her daughter's natural advocacy towards safer outlets, writing letters to local newspapers about community issues, volunteering at animal shelters, participating in school council. But she lived in constant fear that Madison's strong sense of justice would somehow lead them back into Marcus's orbit and the danger that came with it. They had been living in Rochester for 18 months, Victoria working as a paralegal for a small family law firm, while Madison attended a public school where her exceptional intelligence could flourish, when Victoria saw the news report that changed everything. She was cooking dinner while Madison did homework at the kitchen table when the local news anchor's voice caught her attention. "In business news tonight, Wellington Industries CEO Marcus Wellington has been arrested on charges of embezzlement and conspiracy to commit fraud." Victoria's hands went numb, and she dropped the wooden spoon she had been stirring with. On the television screen, Marcus was being led away in handcuffs, his face grim but dignified even in the midst of what was clearly the worst moment of his life. The charges stem from an investigation into missing pension funds and a suspicious warehouse fire that investigators believe was set to cover up financial irregularities. The anchor continued. "Wellington Industries stock has plummeted in after-hours trading, and federal prosecutors are calling this one of the largest corporate fraud cases in recent memory." Victoria sank into a chair, staring at the screen in shock. The man being portrayed as a criminal bore little resemblance to the brilliant principled lawyer she had known 9 years ago. Marcus had been many things: privileged, perhaps naive about the real world, ultimately too weak to fight for their relationship. But he had never been dishonest or cruel. "Mama!" Madison looked up from her homework, concerned by Victoria's sudden stillness. "Are you okay?" Victoria muted the television and forced herself to smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just remembering something from work." But as the days passed and the case dominated the news, Victoria became increasingly convinced that Marcus was being framed. She recognized the methodical way evidence was being presented, the careful construction of a narrative that painted him as guilty while leaving little room for alternative explanations. Using skills she had learned during her years in corporate law, Victoria began her own investigation. She reached out to former contacts who still worked in Manhattan legal circles, carefully gathering information about the case against Marcus. What she discovered made her blood run cold. The evidence against Marcus had been constructed over years, each piece carefully placed by someone with intimate knowledge of his business operations and access to Wellington Industries' internal systems. The person responsible had to be someone Marcus trusted completely, someone who could move freely through his corporate empire while slowly building a case that would destroy him. Richard Blackwood, Marcus's business partner and closest friend since college, had been the one feeding information to prosecutors. He had also been the one systematically embezzling funds while creating a paper trail that led directly to Marcus. And Victoria was certain Blackwood was the one who had threatened her 9 years ago, desperate to ensure she stayed far away from Marcus and couldn't interfere with his long-term plans. Victoria spent months gathering evidence, using every investigative technique she had learned during her legal career. She followed money trails through shell companies, tracked communications between Blackwood and known criminals, and slowly assembled a case that would exonerate Marcus while exposing Blackwood's elaborate fraud. But presenting the evidence would require revealing herself, and Victoria knew that would put both her and Madison in mortal danger. Blackwood had killed to protect his secret. Marcus's missing business partner had been found dead in the Hudson River just weeks before the trial began. If Blackwood discovered that Victoria was still alive and building a case against him, that's when Victoria conceived the plan that would either save them all or destroy everything she had built to protect her daughter. "Madison," she said one evening, as they sat together on their apartment's small balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, "how would you feel about taking a trip to New York?" Madison looked up from the book she was reading, her green eyes bright with curiosity. "Really? We haven't been to a big city in forever." Victoria took her daughter's hand, marveling at how much Madison had grown, how brave and intelligent and compassionate she had become, despite all the challenges they had faced. "There's something very important we need to do there," Victoria said carefully. "Something that might help a good man who's in trouble." Madison set down her book completely, giving her mother her full attention. "What kind of trouble?" "Someone is trying to hurt him by saying he did bad things he didn't really do," Victoria explained, "and we have information that could prove he's innocent." Madison's expression grew serious, the same look she got when confronting injustice at school. "Then we have to help him, Mama. It's not right to let someone get punished for something they didn't do." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes, knowing that her daughter was about to walk into the most dangerous situation of her young life, driven by the same sense of justice that had defined the father she had never met. "Yes," Victoria whispered, squeezing Madison's hand. "We have to help him, no matter what it costs." Judge Hendricks leaned forward in her chair, studying the documents Madison had spread across the prosecutor's table with methodical precision. The courtroom remained suspended in absolute silence, every person present understanding they were witnessing something unprecedented in the annals of American jurisprudence. "These appear to be financial records," the judge said slowly, her experienced eyes scanning bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and corporate communications. "Where exactly did you obtain these documents, Madison?" Madison stood straighter, her small hands clasped behind her back in a gesture that reminded several observers of a miniature attorney addressing the court. "My mom works really hard at her job," she said clearly. "She stays up late lots of nights, looking at papers and making phone calls. She said someone was being mean to an innocent person, and that wasn't fair." Helen Morrison, the prosecutor, moved closer to examine the documents, her expression shifting from skepticism to alarm as she recognized the implications of what she was seeing. Bank records showing systematic transfers from Wellington Industries pension funds to offshore accounts controlled by Richard Blackwood. Email communications between Blackwood and known criminals discussing eliminating problems and ensuring silence. Security footage from angles that had never been presented during the trial, clearly showing Blackwood at the warehouse on the night of the suspicious fire. "Your Honor," Morrison said, her voice tight with controlled panic, "I request an immediate recess to examine these materials more thoroughly, if they're authentic." They're real," Madison interrupted, her 9-year-old voice carrying absolute conviction. "My mom taught me how to check if documents are fake. She said bad people sometimes make up papers to trick other people, but these ones are all real." David Parker, Marcus's defense attorney, was practically vibrating with excitement as he studied copies of the documents. After months of fighting an uphill battle against seemingly insurmountable evidence, he was looking at proof that his client had been systematically framed by his most trusted friend. Marcus himself remained silent in his restraints, his dark eyes fixed on Madison with an intensity that made Victoria's chest tight with anxiety. Even from her position near the back of the courtroom, she could see recognition dawning in his expression, not of who Madison was, but of something familiar in her mannerisms, her fierce determination, the way she tilted her chin when making a point. "The defendant's business partner, Richard Blackwood, has been stealing money for years," Madison continued, pointing to specific line items in the financial records. "He made it look like Mr. Wellington was the one taking the money, but these papers show the truth. Mr. Blackwood has secret bank accounts in other countries, and he's been moving the stolen money there." Judge Hendricks turned to the prosecution table, where Helen Morrison was frantically whispering with her assistants while reviewing the documents. "Ms. Morrison, are you familiar with any of these materials?" Morrison's face had gone pale. "No, Your Honor. These documents were never part of the discovery process. If they're authentic, they represent evidence that was somehow overlooked during our investigation." "Overlooked or deliberately concealed?" David Parker interjected, rising to his feet. "Your Honor, these documents clearly indicate that my client has been the victim of an elaborate frame-up orchestrated by his business partner. I move for immediate dismissal of all charges pending a full investigation into prosecutorial misconduct." The courtroom erupted again, with reporters shouting questions and court security struggling to maintain order. But through the chaos, Madison's clear voice cut like a knife. "There's more! Mr. Blackwood hurt other people too. He made someone disappear because they found out what he was doing." Victoria felt her blood turn to ice. She had coached Madison on what to say about the financial evidence, but her daughter was improvising now, revealing information that could put them both in mortal danger. Judge Hendricks banged her gavel repeatedly, her voice rising above the noise. "Order! I will clear this courtroom if necessary." As the chaos subsided, she turned back to Madison. "What do you mean by made someone disappear?" Madison opened the folder again, pulling out a set of photographs and documents that Victoria hadn't authorized her to bring. With growing horror, Victoria realized her daughter had been conducting her own investigation, gathering evidence that went far beyond what they had discussed. Mr. Wellington's other business partner, Thomas Chen, found out about the stealing. Madison explained, with the matter-of-fact tone children used when reporting playground infractions. "He tried to tell people about it, but Mr. Blackwood had him killed. These pictures show Mr. Blackwood meeting with the bad men who hurt Mr. Chen. The photographs were grainy surveillance shots, but they clearly showed Richard Blackwood meeting with known criminals in locations throughout the city. One particularly damning image showed him handing over an envelope to a man who had been convicted of murder for hire in 3 separate cases. Marcus's restraints suddenly seemed insignificant as he leaned forward, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Tommy Chen is dead?" "I'm afraid so," Judge Hendricks said gently. "Mr. Chen's body was found in the Hudson River 3 weeks ago. The investigation concluded it was a suicide." "It wasn't suicide," Madison said firmly. "These papers prove Mr. Blackwood ordered it because Mr. Chen was going to tell everyone the truth about the stealing." David Parker was frantically taking notes, his legal mind racing through the implications of this new evidence. "Your Honor, if these allegations are true, we're not just looking at frame-up and embezzlement. We're looking at conspiracy to commit murder. My client's life has been in danger from the moment he was arrested." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Richard Blackwood burst through the courtroom doors, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled and his eyes wild with panic. At 42, Blackwood had always projected an image of smooth sophistication, but now he looked like a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse around him. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice carrying across the stunned courtroom. "Marcus, what kind of circus are you running?" Judge Hendricks fixed Blackwood with a stern glare. "Mr. Blackwood, you are not authorized to be in my courtroom during proceedings. I suggest you— Those documents are forgeries," Blackwood interrupted, pointing an accusatory finger at Madison. "This is obviously a desperate attempt to manufacture evidence. Marcus is guilty and everyone knows it." Madison turned to face Blackwood, and Victoria watched in amazement as her shy, gentle daughter transformed into a fierce advocate, her green eyes blazing with righteous anger. "You're the liar," Madison declared, her voice ringing through the courtroom. "You stole money from people who needed it for their families. You hurt Mr. Chen because he was going to tell the truth, and you tried to hurt my mom too." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Victoria felt the world tilt sideways as every eye in the courtroom turned toward her, including Marcus's suddenly intense gaze. She had known this moment would come, had prepared for it, but actually facing Marcus across a crowded courtroom after 9 years felt like stepping off a cliff. Blackwood's face went from red to white as he processed Madison's words. "Your mom?" he repeated slowly, his eyes narrowing as he studied the girl more carefully. "Who exactly is your mother, little girl?" Before Madison could answer, Victoria stepped out of the shadows, walking down the center aisle, with her head held high, despite the terror coursing through her veins. She could feel hundreds of eyes tracking her movement, could hear the whispered speculation rippling through the crowd of observers. But all that mattered was the expression on Marcus's face as recognition dawned. His dark eyes widened, his mouth falling open slightly, as 9 years of questions suddenly received their answer. "Hello, Marcus," Victoria said softly as she reached the front of the courtroom. "I'm sorry it took so long to bring the truth to light." Marcus struggled against his restraints, his voice raw with emotion. "Victoria! But how? Why didn't you?" His gaze swung to Madison, then back to Victoria, and she could see the exact moment when understanding crashed over him like a tidal wave. "The baby," he whispered. Victoria nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Her name is Madison. She's 9 years old, and she's the bravest, smartest, most wonderful person I've ever known. She's also your daughter." The courtroom exploded into chaos again, but Victoria barely noticed. All her attention was focused on Marcus's face as he stared at Madison with wonder, love, and devastating regret. "My daughter," he repeated, as if testing how the words felt. "She's my daughter." Blackwood, meanwhile, had gone completely silent, his calculating mind clearly working through the implications of this revelation. If Victoria was alive, if she had evidence of his crimes, if she could testify about the threats that had driven her away. "This is impossible," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled again. "Victoria Sterling disappeared years ago. This woman is obviously an imposter, paid to disrupt these proceedings with manufactured evidence and false claims." Judge Hendricks studied Victoria with the same careful attention she had given Madison's documents. "Can you prove your identity, Miss Sterling?" Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out a worn manila envelope, her hands shaking slightly as she opened it. Inside were copies of her original birth certificate, her Harvard Law diploma, employment records from Morrison and Associates, and Madison's birth certificate listing Marcus Wellington as the father. "I never wanted to disappear," Victoria said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke the truth she had hidden for 9 years. "I was threatened, stalked, terrorized by people who wanted me to stay away from Marcus. I was young and scared and pregnant, and I thought running was the only way to keep my baby safe." She turned to face Blackwood directly, no longer the frightened young woman who had fled in the middle of the night. "But I know now who was behind those threats. I know who wanted me gone badly enough to hire criminals to make it happen, and I have evidence that will prove it." Blackwood's mask finally slipped completely, his urbane facade cracking to reveal the cold-blooded killer underneath. "You don't know anything," he snarled. "You're a nobody from Queens who got lucky one night and thought she could climb above her station. You should have stayed gone." "Maybe," Victoria said calmly, "but I couldn't let an innocent man go to prison for your crimes. And I couldn't let my daughter grow up thinking her father was a criminal when the real criminal was standing right beside him, pretending to be his friend." Madison moved to stand beside her mother, taking Victoria's hand in her small one. "We're not afraid of you anymore," she said, looking directly at Blackwood. "The police will arrest you now, and you can't hurt anyone else." Blackwood's eyes darted around the courtroom, clearly calculating his options. Court security had moved closer, recognizing the potential for violence, but Blackwood was still a free man until formal charges could be filed. "This is all very touching," he said with forced casualness, "but you're forgetting something important. Even if your little fairy tale is true, even if you have real evidence, I have resources you can't imagine. I have connections, influence, and the kind of money that makes problems disappear permanently." The threat was clear, and Victoria felt Madison's hand tighten in hers. But before she could respond, Marcus's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "The only thing disappearing will be you, Richard," he said, his tone carrying a cold fury that made everyone in the courtroom take notice. "You framed me, stole from our company, murdered Tommy, and threatened my family. When I get out of these restraints, you're going to pay for every single thing you've done." Judge Hendricks had heard enough. "Bailiff, place Mr. Blackwood under arrest pending investigation of the charges presented here today. And someone get those restraints off Mr. Wellington immediately." As court security moved to arrest Blackwood, he made one last desperate gambit, lunging toward Madison with violence in his eyes. But Victoria was faster, stepping between Blackwood and her daughter, just as Marcus broke free of his loosened restraints. The tackle that brought Blackwood down was a joint effort between Marcus and 2 bailiffs, but it was Marcus who held him pinned to the courtroom floor, his face inches from Blackwood's as he spoke in a voice only his former friend could hear. "If you ever come near my daughter again," Marcus said softly, "I will end you. Do you understand me?" Blackwood's only response was a string of curses as he was hauled away in handcuffs, his carefully constructed empire finally crumbling around him. As the immediate chaos subsided, Marcus found himself standing face to face with Victoria and Madison, the family he had never known he had, the future he had thought was lost forever. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking as he looked down at Madison. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there for you. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder to find your mother. I'm sorry for everything. Madison studied him with the serious expression she wore when considering important matters. Then, with the wisdom that sometimes emerged from children who had seen too much of the world's darkness, she smiled. "It's okay," she said simply. "Mama explained that you didn't know about me, and that you would have loved me if you did. She was right, wasn't she?" Marcus knelt down to Madison's eye level, tears streaming down his face as he looked into eyes that were exactly like Victoria's. "Yes," he whispered, "I love you more than I ever thought possible. You're the most amazing little girl in the world, and I'm so proud to be your father." Madison considered this for a moment, then threw her arms around Marcus's neck in the kind of fierce hug that children reserved for people they trusted completely. "I love you too, Daddy," she said, and Victoria felt her heart shatter and rebuild itself all at once. 6 months later, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office announced that all charges against Marcus Wellington had been dropped and that Richard Blackwood would face trial for embezzlement, conspiracy, and first-degree murder. The story dominated business news for weeks, with Wellington Industries' stock recovering and Marcus being hailed as both a victim of corporate betrayal and a hero for exposing one of the largest financial fraud schemes in recent memory. But for Victoria, the real transformation had nothing to do with headlines or stock prices. It was in the quiet moments, Marcus reading bedtime stories to Madison in the guest room of his penthouse apartment, teaching her to play chess on lazy Sunday afternoons, helping her with math homework that challenged even his MBA-educated mind. "She's so much like you," Victoria told him one evening as they watched Madison through the kitchen doorway, where she was conducting a serious conversation with Marcus's housekeeper about the proper way to fold napkins. "That stubborn streak, the way she tilts her chin when she's making a point, her absolute intolerance for injustice." Marcus smiled, wrapping his arms around Victoria from behind as they stood together in the doorway of what had once been his lonely bachelor kitchen. "She gets the intelligence from her mother," he said, pressing a kiss to Victoria's temple. "And the courage. 9 years old, and she saved my life without hesitation." The transition hadn't been entirely smooth. Madison was brilliant and adaptable, but moving from their modest apartment to Marcus's penthouse had been overwhelming at first. She missed her old school, her friends, the familiar routines that had defined her life. There were tears and tantrums, moments when she retreated into herself or lashed out at the dramatic changes surrounding her. But Marcus approached fatherhood with the same intensity he brought to everything else, determined to earn his daughter's trust and love, rather than simply expecting it because of biology. He learned her favorite foods, memorized her schedule, and spent hours listening to her talk about books and animals and the complex social dynamics of fourth-grade politics. Victoria watched their relationship develop with a mixture of joy and terror. Joy because seeing Marcus with Madison confirmed everything she had believed about the kind of man he truly was beneath the privilege and pressure. Terror because she knew how easy it would be to lose herself in this fairy tale ending, to forget that the real world still existed outside the protective bubble of wealth and influence Marcus provided. "We need to talk," Victoria said one evening after Madison had gone to bed, finding Marcus in his study, where he was reviewing contracts for Wellington Industries' expansion into renewable energy. Marcus looked up from his laptop, immediately alert to the serious tone in her voice. Over the past months, he had learned to read Victoria's expressions with the same careful attention he gave to market fluctuations and board meetings. "About us," Victoria continued, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "About what happens next." Marcus closed his laptop and gave her his full attention. "What do you want to happen next?" It was such a simple question, but it cut to the heart of everything Victoria had been struggling with since their reunion. What did she want? The obvious answer was this: Marcus, Madison, the family they were building together. But life had taught her that wanting something and being able to keep it were entirely different things. "I want Madison to be happy," Victoria said carefully. "I want her to have everything she needs to thrive. The education, the opportunities, the stability she deserves." "But," Marcus prompted, hearing the hesitation in her voice. Victoria took a deep breath, forcing herself to voice the fears that had been keeping her awake at night. "But I don't want her to grow up thinking that love means someone rescuing you from your problems. I don't want her to learn that women need to be saved by wealthy men in order to have value." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering her words with the same careful analysis he applied to complex legal briefs. "Is that what you think is happening here? That I'm rescuing you?" "Aren't you?" Victoria asked. "6 months ago, I was a single mother working as a paralegal, struggling to pay rent on a one-bedroom apartment. Now I'm living in a penthouse, Madison goes to the most exclusive private school in Manhattan, and I haven't worked a day since the trial ended. How is that not a rescue?" "Because you're the one who saved me," Marcus said simply. "You and Madison. You risked everything to prove my innocence when you could have stayed hidden, stayed safe. You came forward knowing that Blackwood might kill you for it. How is that me rescuing you?" Victoria felt tears prick her eyes, but she pushed forward. "That's not what I mean, and you know it. I mean financially, practically. You've solved all our material problems with your credit card and your connections. Madison will never want for anything again, and neither will I. But what happens to us as people? What happens to our independence, our sense of self-worth?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What do you want to do?" "I want to work," Victoria said immediately. "I want to practice law again, to use my education and experience for something meaningful. I want Madison to see that women can be partners, not dependents." "Then do it," Marcus said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. Victoria blinked, caught off guard by his ready agreement. Just like that. Just like that. Marcus stood and moved around the desk to sit on its edge, closer to her chair. "Victoria, I don't want to own you or control you. I want to love you, support you, build a life with you. If working makes you happy, if it's important to you, then it's important to me too." "It won't be easy," Victoria warned. "I've been out of corporate law for 9 years. I'll have to start over, prove myself all over again, and people will talk, will say I only got opportunities because of my connection to you." Marcus reached out to take her hands in his touch warm and reassuring. "Let them talk. Anyone who sees you in action will know you earned whatever you achieve. You're brilliant, Victoria. You always were. The legal community will be lucky to have you back." Victoria felt something tight in her chest finally begin to loosen. "You really mean that?" "I really mean that." Marcus brought her hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. Besides, Wellington Industries could use a good corporate attorney. Someone who specializes in ethics compliance and fraud prevention. Someone who knows how to spot the warning signs that everyone else missed. Victoria laughed despite her tears. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you whatever you want," Marcus said seriously. "A job, a partnership, your own law firm, if that's what would make you happy. I have resources, connections, influence. Why shouldn't I use them to help the woman I love achieve her dreams?" "Because people will say—" "People will always say something," Marcus interrupted gently. "The question is, do we live our lives according to other people's opinions, or do we build something real together and let the results speak for themselves?" Victoria studied his face, seeing not the privileged heir to a business empire, but the man who had spent the last 6 months learning to braid Madison's hair, who had cried when Madison called him daddy for the first time. who had somehow managed to love them both without trying to change them or mold them into something more suitable for his world. "I love you," she said suddenly, the words coming out in a rush. "I've loved you since that night 9 years ago, and I never stopped, even when I thought I'd never see you again." Marcus's face transformed, his careful control giving way to something raw and vulnerable and entirely real. "I love you too," he said, sliding off the desk to kneel beside her chair. "I think I loved you before I even knew what love was supposed to feel like. You and Madison, you're everything I never knew I needed." When he kissed her, Victoria felt herself finally letting go of the fear and caution that had defined her life for so long. This wasn't a rescue or a fairy tale ending. This was two people who had found their way back to each other despite impossible odds, who were choosing to build something together based on love and respect and shared values. "Marry me," Marcus whispered against her lips. Victoria pulled back to look at him, her heart racing. "Is that a question or a statement?" "It's a request," Marcus said, his dark eyes serious. "Marry me, Victoria. Not because you need me to take care of you, not because it would be convenient or practical, but because we love each other and we want to be a family, really and truly and legally a family." Victoria thought of Madison sleeping peacefully down the hall, dreaming whatever dreams filled the minds of 9-year-old girls who had saved their fathers and gained a family in the process. She thought of the law career she wanted to rebuild, the independence she was determined to maintain, the life she and Marcus could create together if they were brave enough to try. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." Marcus kissed her again, deeper this time, with the passion of someone who had thought he'd lost everything and discovered he'd actually found it. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing, Victoria heard a small voice from the doorway. "Does this mean you're going to be my real parents now?" Madison asked, rubbing her eyes sleepily. "We've always been your real parents, sweetheart," Victoria said, opening her arms to welcome Madison into the circle of their embrace. "But yes, now it's going to be official." Madison considered this with the serious expression she wore when processing important information. "Good," she said finally, settling into the space between Marcus and Victoria with the contentment of a child who finally understood where she belonged. "I was hoping you'd figure that out soon." Marcus laughed, the sound rich with joy and relief and infinite possibility. "Have I mentioned lately that our daughter is smarter than both of us combined?" "Our daughter," Victoria repeated softly, testing the words. After 9 years of carrying the weight of parenthood alone, sharing it felt like being able to breathe deeply for the first time in memory. "Our daughter," Marcus agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of Madison's head. "Our family." As they sat together in the warm circle of lamplight, Victoria finally understood that some fairy tales weren't about being rescued at all. Sometimes they were about having the courage to save yourself and then discovering that the best kind of love was the kind that made you stronger rather than smaller, braver rather than more dependent. Sometimes they were about little girls who stood up in courtrooms and refused to let injustice prevail, who brought families together through sheer force of will and unwavering belief in what was right. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, they were about finding your way home to the people who loved you exactly as you were, who supported your dreams instead of trying to replace them, who understood that the strongest families were built on partnership rather than power. Outside the study windows, New York City glittered with 1,000,000 lights, each one representing dreams and struggles and the endless human capacity for hope. Somewhere in that vast urban landscape, other families were being torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. Other children were learning to be brave in situations no child should face. Other women were making impossible choices between love and safety, between their hearts and their survival. But in this moment, in this room, Victoria Sterling was exactly where she belonged. 18 months later, on a crisp October morning, when Central Park was painted in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Victoria Sterling Wellington stood before a judge for the second time in 2 years. But this time, instead of exposing criminal conspiracies, she was taking vows that would bind her life to Marcus's forever. The ceremony was small and intimate, held in the garden of Marcus's estate in the Hamptons, with only their closest friends and family in attendance. Madison served as maid of honor, resplendent in a dress of pale yellow silk that made her look like captured sunlight. She had insisted on writing her own speech for the occasion, and as she stood before the assembled guests, her confidence and poise made it easy to forget she was still only 10 years old. "When I was little," Madison began, her clear voice carrying across the garden, "I used to wonder why other kids had daddies, and I didn't. Mama always told me that my daddy loved me but couldn't be with us, and that someday I would understand why." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to her daughter speak, marveling at the young woman Madison was becoming. The past 18 months had transformed all of them, but Madison most of all. She had flourished in her new school, made friends who challenged her intellectually and socially, and developed a confidence that came from finally understanding her place in the world. "Now I know that sometimes families have to be apart before they can be together," Madison continued. "Sometimes people have to be brave and do scary things to protect the people they love. And sometimes little girls have to stand up in big rooms full of grown-ups and tell the truth, even when it's hard." Marcus reached for Victoria's hand, squeezing gently as Madison's words washed over them. He was wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that emphasized his dark coloring, but it was the expression on his face that took Victoria's breath away, pure love and pride and wonder at the family they had created together. "But the most important thing I learned," Madison said, her green eyes bright with unshed tears, "is that the best families are the ones that choose each other every single day. Mama chose to protect me when I was too little to protect myself. Daddy chose to love us even when he was scared and confused. And I choose both of them every day because they make each other happy and they make me feel safe." The applause that followed Madison's speech was warm and heartfelt, but Victoria barely heard it. She was thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment, the choices and sacrifices and moments of courage that had woven their lives together. Victoria had returned to practicing law 6 months after Marcus's trial ended, joining a prestigious firm that specialized in corporate ethics and white-collar crime prevention. The work was challenging and meaningful, using her experience with Marcus's case to help other companies identify and prevent internal fraud. She had quickly established herself as one of the city's leading experts in corporate corruption, her reputation built on skill and knowledge rather than her connection to the Wellington family. Marcus had undergone his own transformation, using his experience as a fraud victim to advocate for stronger corporate oversight and victim protection laws. Wellington Industries had become a leader in ethical business practices, with Marcus frequently speaking at conferences and congressional hearings about the need for transparency in corporate governance. Together, they had created the Wellington Sterling Foundation, a non-profit organization that provided legal aid to victims of white-collar crime and supported programs that taught children about justice and advocacy. Madison had been their first and most enthusiastic volunteer, helping to design educational materials and speaking to other children about the importance of standing up for what was right. Victoria Sterling, Judge Patricia Hendricks said, her voice warm with affection as she officiated the ceremony. "Do you take Marcus Wellington to be your husband, to love and honor, to support and challenge, in prosperity and adversity, for as long as you both shall live?" Victoria looked into Marcus's eyes, seeing not just the successful businessman or the devoted father, but the man who had spent the past 18 months proving that love meant partnership, not possession. He had supported her career ambitions without reservation, celebrated her successes as enthusiastically as his own, and never once suggested that her happiness should take a back seat to his convenience. "I do," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Marcus Wellington," Judge Hendricks continued, "do you take Victoria Sterling to be your wife, to love and honor, to support and challenge, in prosperity and adversity, for as long as you both shall live?" Marcus's answer came without hesitation, his dark eyes never leaving Victoria's face. "I do. Then by the power vested in me by the state of New York," Judge Hendricks declared with a smile, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Marcus, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle and sweet, full of promise and joy, and the quiet confidence of two people who had found their way home to each other. When they finally broke apart, the garden erupted in cheers and applause, but Victoria felt as though she and Marcus were the only two people in the world. As they turned to face their guests, Madison stepped forward to present them with the rings she had been carefully guarding throughout the ceremony. But instead of the simple gold bands they had selected, she held up rings that were clearly different, more elaborate, more meaningful. "I had these made special," Madison announced proudly. "Daddy, yours has 3 stones, one for each of us, and Mama, yours has our birthstones all together, so we'll always be connected." Victoria examined her ring through tears, seeing that Madison had somehow arranged for sapphires, emeralds and diamonds to be set in an intricate pattern that was both beautiful and deeply personal. "Madison, sweetheart, when did you do this?" "I've been planning it for months," Madison said matter-of-factly. "Uncle David helped me find a jewelry person who could make them exactly right. I wanted them to be perfect for our family." Marcus knelt down to Madison's level, his voice thick with emotion. "They are perfect, just like you." The reception that followed was filled with laughter and dancing, and the kind of joy that came from celebrating not just a wedding, but the creation of a family that had overcome impossible odds to find each other. Victoria danced with her new husband under strings of lights that turned the garden into something magical, feeling like the luckiest woman alive. But the moment that would stay with her forever came later, when the guests had gone home, and the 3 of them sat together on the terrace overlooking the ocean. Madison was curled up between Victoria and Marcus, drowsy from excitement and cake, her head resting on Marcus's shoulder while her feet were tucked under Victoria's leg. "Are we going to live happily ever after now?" Madison asked sleepily. Victoria and Marcus exchanged a look over their daughter's head, both thinking of the challenges that still lay ahead. Marriage was work, parenting was constantly evolving, and building a life together required daily choices to love and support and forgive each other. "I think," Marcus said carefully, "that we're going to live. Really and truly live, with all the happy parts and the hard parts and everything in between, and we're going to do it together." Madison considered this with her usual seriousness. "That sounds better than a fairy tale," she decided. "Fairy tales always end when the people get married. But real life keeps going, and that's when the really good stuff happens." Victoria felt her heart overflow with love for this remarkable child who had somehow become wiser than her years should have allowed. "You're absolutely right, baby girl. The really good stuff is just beginning." As the stars emerged over the Atlantic and the sound of waves provided a gentle soundtrack to their conversation, Victoria reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A little girl's courage in a crowded courtroom had saved an innocent man, exposed a criminal, and reunited a family that had been torn apart by fear and misunderstanding. But more than that, it had proven that justice wasn't just something that happened in courtrooms or corporate boardrooms. It was something that lived in the hearts of people who refused to accept injustice, who were willing to risk everything to protect the innocent, who understood that the most powerful force in the world was love, backed by unwavering courage. Madison had taught them all that sometimes the smallest voices could move mountains, that children could be heroes, and that families weren't defined by biology or circumstances, but by the choices people made to love and protect and support each other. "I love you both so much," Victoria whispered, pulling Madison closer and reaching for Marcus's hand. "We love you too, Mama," Madison murmured against Marcus's shirt. "Forever and always." "Forever and always," Marcus agreed, his arm tightening around both of his girls. And as the night wrapped around them like a blessing, Victoria Sterling Wellington finally understood that some stories didn't end with happily ever after. The best ones ended with happily ever onward, with families who chose each other every day, with love that grew stronger through challenges rather than weaker, with children who grew up believing that courage and justice and love could change the world. Because sometimes, if you were very blessed indeed, they actually could. The moon rose full and bright over the ocean, casting silver light across the garden where a family had been reborn, where love had triumphed over fear, where a little girl's unwavering sense of justice had saved them all. And in the distance, barely audible above the sound of waves, came the faint echo of wedding bells, carrying their joy across the water to touch the dreams of anyone brave enough to believe in second chances, in the power of truth, and in the extraordinary things that could happen when ordinary people found the courage to do what was right. In courtrooms across the city, other trials were ending, other verdicts being rendered, other families being torn apart or brought together by the wheels of justice. But none of those stories would be quite like this one, where a 9-year-old girl had stood up before the most powerful people in the world and declared with absolute certainty that an innocent man deserved to be free, and in doing so had set them all free to love, to hope, and to build a future worthy of the courage it had taken to save it.